Hello, my name is Marco Pernpruner and I'm going to present our paper The Good, the Bad and the Not So Ugly of Out-of-Band Authentication with eID cards and push notifications developed within the Security and Trust Research Unit of Fondazione Bruno Kessler in Italy. Let's look at the agenda. First of all, I'm going to introduce the context and the motivations underlying our work. Then I will move on to the design and implementation of the protocol. I'll then detail the security and risk analysis that we performed, and finally, I will draw some conclusions. Let's begin with the first item. Passwords are the weakest link in the authentication chain. Just to have an idea, here you can find a list of the 25 most used passwords in 2019. What is even worse is that users also tend to use the same passwords for every account, and this is very dangerous. For these reasons, authentication protocols are moving towards more secure solutions as multi-factor authentication and passwordless authentication. When dealing with sensitive context as public administration services, banking accounts, or medical records, the real identity of the person who's trying to access some specific data or services must be known, and while this is simple in the reality, it could be much more difficult in an online context. For this reason, many countries have been releasing electronic identity cards, also called eID cards, that provide a high level of assurance referring to the eIDAS regulation that has been issued by the European Union. These documents are equipped with a contactless chip that can be read through any NFC interface, and they also contain some cryptographic features as an X509 certificate enabling a public key infrastructure. All these functionalities are protected by a PIN code. Let's focus for a while on the Italian use case, where citizens can already authenticate through their eID cards in two different scenarios. In the first one, from their mobile device's browser, by leveraging an official application called CID that requires them to insert the PIN code of the eID card, to read the eID card through the NFC capabilities of the mobile device, and they will be finally authenticated on the mobile device's browser. However, this protocol leads to some usability issues connected with the small size of screens and the lack of physical keyboards. On the other hand, users can also use their personal computer's browser to authenticate. That would be much more suitable in these cases. However, this scenario relies on external NFC readers that users have to buy by themselves and bring with them at any need. So what we wanted to do is to strike a balance between these two different scenarios by picking the main advantages of each of them. We thus realized a hybrid solution where citizens can authenticate from their personal computer's browser by leveraging common devices such as smartphones to interact with the eID card, so without any need for additional devices. From these considerations, we can identify a list of requirements that have been inferred from the Italian scenario but can actually be extended to any other. So eID cards must be involved in the authentication process due to the high level of assurance they provide. The protocol must not rely on passwords that, as we saw before, are extremely weak. The authentication must be performed on a personal computer by leveraging common devices to interact with the eID card. And since we have these two distinct devices that are the personal computer and, for instance, the smartphone, we need a way to connect them. And the way we chose to do this is through push notifications that are actually suggested by NIST in these cases. So first, we analyzed the state of the art, looking for any available solution that could fulfill all our requirements. But unfortunately, we couldn't find any. Therefore, we designed and implemented a tailor-made authentication solution that could comply with all our requirements. We then performed a security analysis based on formal techniques to assess the overall security of the protocol, and finally a risk analysis to evaluate the risks connected with our protocol and to identify a mitigation plan. Let's go to the design. The goal of our protocol is to let a user authenticate onto a specific online service called Service Provider from his personal computer's browser, through his eID card and his mobile device. Many other entities are involved in the protocol, such as the identity provider that is the actual responsible for handling the user's digital identities. As for the push notification infrastructure, we chose to rely on Firebase Cloud Messaging, but actually many other solutions could be used instead. In order to be able to do the right path, so to actually deliver the push notification, the identity provider must be able to connect the personal computer's browser and the mobile device that will be the recipient of the push notification. To this end, we need to establish a preliminary phase called enrollment, requiring the user to insert his user ID, that is a unique piece of information that uniquely identifies him. Then, he's required to scan a QR code through the mobile application, to insert the PIN code of the eID card, to read the ID card through NFC, and at the end of the operation, a cookie connected with both the user ID and the mobile device that has been used will be stored in the personal computer's browser. So when the user wants to authenticate later, he just needs to insert his user ID, and the browser will retrieve the corresponding cookie and will send these values to the identity provider, that after checking the link between the user ID and the cookie's value, will send the actual notification. Once the user gets the push notification, he just needs to insert the PIN code of the ID card, to read the ID card through NFC, and he will be authenticated on the personal computer's browser. What really happens behind the scenes is that a challenge response protocol is involved, consisting in the identity provider generating a challenge that is a string of characters connected with the ongoing operation that is sent to the mobile application and then to the eID card. The eID card uses its private key to sign the value of the challenge, thus getting the so-called response, and this response is sent back to the identity provider that uses the public key of the eID card that is actually known to unencrypt the value and check that it matches the original one. Here you can find a message sequence chart that we drew for our protocol, detailing all the operations involved. Specifically, the red operations are the ones connected with the challenge response protocol that I just described. So after designing the protocol, we wanted to assess its security, and so we first had to identify the authentication factors involved, that are the PIN code of the eID card, that is a knowledge factor, and the eID card itself, the mobile device, and the cookie, that are possession factors. Now it is important to highlight that although our protocol involves a PIN, it still complies with the passwordless requirement, since yes, PINs and passwords could be similar, since both of them need to be memorized by users. However, in this context they are deeply different, since the PIN is just a second factor to locally activate the eID card, that according to the NIST is a multi-factor cryptographic device. So once the PIN is compromised, the eID card still needs to be compromised as well before an attack is possible. On the other hand, passwords are frequently used as only factors protecting online accounts, and so once a password is compromised, the whole account is already compromised in turn. As for the threat model, we defined some physical attackers, such as thieves, some software attackers, such as malware, and some hybrid attackers that can act both physically and remotely. The security property that we want our protocol to meet is that the service provider authenticates the user through an identity provider assertion. What we expected is that only explicit attackers could break the protocol, where these attackers are those who are able to compromise all the authentication factors involved. So we defined the capability of our attackers, and we first performed a combinatorial analysis, detecting that no single attacker is able to explicitly compromise the protocol, while some combinations of them actually are, specifically these 10 combinations. What we wanted to prove now is that the only way to compromise the protocol is by breaking all the authentication factors involved, and so that only explicit attackers could break the protocol. So, we decided to rely on a formal framework composed of the specification language Aslan++ that is part of the Avanzar project, and by following some previous works, through this language we modeled the specification of the protocol, the properties of the communication channel, the capabilities of the attackers, and finally the security property to be met. All these specifications were then given in input to SetMC, a model checker for security protocols that analyzes the protocol and gives in output either yes, the protocol is safe, or no, the protocol is not safe, and here is an attack trace displaying why. What the formal analysis discovered is that two of our attackers, specifically the man in the browser and the authenticator duplicator, are able to perform a new category of attack that we called implicit, since they don't need to compromise all the authentication factors, but in this case only the cookie to compromise the protocol. I'll now focus on the man in the browser to describe how this attack works. Let's suppose that a user wants to authenticate onto a specific online service, and so he inserts his user ID. But the man in the browser has full control of the user's browser, and so the attacker can launch an authentication request on the same online service by using the same user ID. Now, the user expects a push notification to be delivered to his mobile device, but unfortunately the man in the browser can block the legitimate request. And since the attacker is also in possession of the user's cookie, the user will be receiving a push notification connected with the malicious attempt of the attacker. And since the user is not aware of this, he will be deceived into completing the operation. At the end, he will be displayed a common error message by the man in the browser, while the attacker will be authenticated on behalf of the user without the user's awareness. So what we discovered is that in addition to explicit attackers, we also have some implicit attackers, that are those who are able to compromise the protocol without compromising all the authentication factors involved. And here you can find a summary of the 10 explicit and 2 implicit attackers that are successful. So after detecting the attackers, we wanted to associate each of them with the related risk. And so we rely on the OWASP risk rating methodology that identifies the risk as a combination between the likelihood and the impact, where the likelihood is the probability of an attack happening, while the impact rates the consequences on the organization in case the attack was successful. We also identified some factors to be rated to compute both the likelihood and the impact, and thus the overall risk. By focusing on the results, we can see that the risk is low in 10 out of 12 cases, it's medium in one case, and high in another one. The medium risk attack is an explicit combination between the man in the browser and the man in the mobile, while the high risk attack is exactly the implicit attack involving the man in the browser that I just described. To further reduce the risks, we can identify some mitigations to implement. As for the man in the mobile, we can implement a root checking library that prevents the mobile application from working on rooted devices. As for the authenticator duplicator, we can display on the mobile device a one-time password to be written on the personal computer's browser during the authentication attempt. As for the man in the browser, it is much more difficult to completely defeat it, since it is a very powerful attack. Anyway, we can try to reduce the risks, for instance by displaying on the mobile device some identifying information about the authentication attempt that has been launched on the personal computer's browser, such as the location. To summarize what we did, we can refer to the title of the paper, where the good is the new authentication protocol that we designed to improve the usability while keeping a high level of security. The bad is the new category of implicit attacks that we found during the formal analysis. And the not so ugly is the result of the risk analysis, highlighting that our protocol has an acceptable level of security. As for the future works, we plan to analyze the security of other authentication solutions relying on eID cards, to understand how things change when moving from authentication to authorization, for instance in the financial context, and to develop a tool to make the risk analysis of authentication solutions automatic. So I reached the end of my presentation, and I thank you very much for your attention.